Coming up, with the Denver Nuggets officially crowned NBA champions, it's also officially the NBA offseason, and we break out our predictions from superstar acquisitions, in-house free agents, and the draft. We break it all down coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie. He's the owner-operator of DFSR. For all your daily fantasy sports rankings from DraftKings to FanDuel, he's got you covered. I'm Adam Arbrecht, breaking down the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast. My boy, Andy Mack, we thank you for making us your first listen of the day. We're free on all those great platforms. And Doug, it is officially the offseason. No more speculation. The Denver Nuggets won. Joker might be the best player in the NBA now. And we get to turn our attention to how the Nets will make key decisions across several key areas, from superstars, free agency, and, of course, the draft.
Yeah, look, it's been the offseason for the Nets for a while here, but now we're officially into the offseason for all teams, which means all teams are sort of we've re-leveled the playing field in terms of news and notes and movement and all this other stuff. It's kind of an exciting time, especially if you've been grinding away on the NBA beat here for months and months and months. And the NBA is cool because, I mean, we get an awesome finals, which we won't relitigate here. You go listen to Locked On Nuggets if you want some of that, because our man Matt's really holding it down there. But in terms of like what could be happening this offseason, we could see like borderline historic upheaval and movement across the league. And the Nets are definitely poised to be part of it one way or the other. At like minimum as part of the discussion, and at maximum, like an overhaul of their own. Right. So I think it is. Yeah. I think we agreed it's a good time to official NBA season over. We're all in the same place. Let's kind of like take a look at what are some of the things that could be. Let's make sure we're just like, I'm all on the same page here about what could be happening for the Nets this offseason.
And ironically enough, the Denver Nuggets, even little drips and drafts came out. They made a trade involving draft capital coming up here. So even teams, while competing for titles, were also saying, hey, it's not too far away. And unlike other sports, NBA lines up their schedule and their dates really just incredibly smart, right? The finals are going on, and you're a week away from the NBA draft, and you're a couple of weeks away from free agency. So it really does start to create a bit of a whirlwind here. And for the Brooklyn Nets, we've talked about it before, what lies ahead for this team, and the biggest decision, and one that's been rumored a lot as far as top teams pursuing potentially a Damian Lillard trade, is whether or not the Nets will ultimately make a move like that. You'll go first on this one. Where do you stand on Damian Lillard? We've talked about this before, but it does seem like it's reaching about as peak levels as possible here, that it truly could be an option for the Nets if they want it.
Yeah, one thing I forgot to mention, or we forgot to mention at the top, it's like we just wanted to make a few predictions here too. Like we're going to be predicting, you can predict right along with us. Like we're going to stake our claim on some of these hot button topics right now, what we think are going to happen. And then we'll kind of see how it goes. Yeah, obviously Lillard is talking point one. He's been rumored around the Nets here for a while now. He came out and said it. It was a bit of a leading question from Chris Haynes around like what teams would you want to be on? And he mentioned obviously playing with Mikal Bridges in Brooklyn would be one of his choices. He mentioned the Heat as well. If I had to make a prediction right now, I'd be curious. We didn't talk too much about where we each land here. My prediction is Damian Lillard is not a Net come next year. And I do not think he's traded before the draft. I do think he is ultimately traded, but I do not think that team that he's traded to is the Brooklyn Nets.
It is interesting because that little piece you mentioned there, I'll agree with you. I do not think that Damian Lillard will be a Brooklyn Net, but you mentioned the key piece of him being traded by draft night, which leads me to think Portland is going to use that pick and then go back to Damian Lillard and say, how do you feel? Yes, we went with Scoot Henderson, if that's the player, and this is what we think we can do, right? How can we figure out a way to keep you potentially? And the other thing that informs me on this too, because we talked about this before, but I just did the episode with Joe Mullinax from Locked On Grizzlies, and we were talking about that if they come knocking for Mikal Bridges. But the other way I looked at that was when Joe said, hey, 4 first-round picks, 2 swaps, putting in multiple players into that conversation, while it might not be the right fit necessarily for Damian Lillard, I did make me think, right, there's teams with a lot of draft capital here that could get into the Damian Lillard waters. And I think the threshold for Sean Marks and the Nets is going to be, yeah, we'll do something maybe to have those talks, but we're not going that deep into it. I think there's going to be more desperate teams for Damian Lillard services.
Yeah. And I actually think it's right in front of us too. If I had to predict, like, because where one of the reasons I'm actually going off board here with Lillard not coming, I don't know if it's off board, why I'm going into the Lillard not coming to the Nets. I do think that they'll make offers. I do think there probably is some mutual sort of want around this thing of it. I do tend to think though, where it stands with Lillard is that if he actually is ring chasing here, and which he probably should be at this point, and you're trying to go to a team that has a legit chance, who probably would fit in like perfectly with, and by the way, was just in the finals. Yeah. Like, it makes so much sense for Miami to just go all in to try to just put him on. He's like the exact guy they needed, right? Like, just like on ball scoring, really could have used it. Like, and by the way, when he mentioned the list of teams that he wanted to go to, Miami was the first one, then Brooklyn, right? So like, and they're just so much closer. They're just so much closer. And if there's going to be if the Blazers, sorry, one last thing, if the Blazers are incentivized to like make Dame happy here while also getting off the contract, which I do think probably appeals to them, I just think even if Miami's like package was slightly worse, they might even do that, because it's just a better landing spot for him if he wants to try to win a championship in like the next 2 years.
And if you think about those, even recently in the last day or so, network sponsor FanDuel TV had Shams Charania on, who just reiterated that at the trade deadline, Miami did in fact make an offer to the Brooklyn Nets for Kyrie Irving. Ultimately ends up in Dallas. We know that. Ultimately, the Brooklyn Nets were not interested in keeping Kyrie Irving in the Eastern Conference. And Damian Lillard also looked at it, I think, by all accounts, and says the Eastern Conference is a more palatable avenue if I want to make that pursuit. You mentioned Miami there as well. So I think it all makes sense. I know that fans, I think by and large, have looked at this maybe more so on the way of saying we would go for Damian Lillard, but there's been some reservation around his age and around what it means for the ceiling of this team. So I don't think this is a cut and dry, wow, he's an incredible talent, you have to go get him. I'll be very curious to see how things build up as we get towards the draft. The next phase then for us, though, is the in-house guy, and you can give your note before we transition, but it's going to be obviously one Cameron Johnson, his contract, and whether or not we think that the Nets will go to the table, especially as maybe his market continues to grow.
Yeah, and that's definitely something that seems like it's growing with every passing day. We'll get into that and where things might stand with Cameron Johnson here in a second. First, going to tell you about our friends over at Prize Picks. Look, Prize Picks is daily fantasy made very, very easy. They figured this out, folks. You're not wrangling with salaries. You're not going against sharks in the water. You're not trying to figure out all these different ways to put together different combinations when it's based on like money and stuff. No, you're going more or less on the Prize Picks player projections. It's just you versus them on a bunch of different stats. So NBA over right now, that's no big deal, because that Prize Picks has got you covered all the way through with MLB, PGA, NFL feels like it's right around the corner. On Prize Picks, you're putting together 2 to 6 players. You're just figuring out if they're going to score more or less than the Prize Picks projections. You can win up to 25 times your money on any entry. You're not competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections available. All you got to do is download Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up to play daily fantasy sports. First-time users going to grab 100% instant deposit match up to $100. You got to use the promo code Locked On. If you deposit 100, Prize Picks will give you 100. You deposit 50, Prize Picks will give you 50. You can figure out all the different other combinations in there. Don't forget to enter the promo code Locked On at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy.
All right, so as we turn our attention to the next topic of conversation and the Nets topic of conversation and one Cameron Johnson, I want to remind everybody too, as this offseason rolls on, we're actually involved in a new Locked On Network campaign over on Subtext. You'll see it inside of the description on our YouTube channel. You'll see it on the podcast feed as well. It's basically exclusive access to Doug Norrie and myself. As the draft approaches, you want to hear about a prospect, you're going to be able to get information we're not going to have enough time to do and cover on the podcast itself. So you can go over and click that link, sign up for it, free trial for 14 days. It's only $4.99 after that. That's not too shabby to get yours truly and Doug in on the conversation. Now, Cameron Johnson, his market, we talked about this going back a couple of weeks and how it seems to be growing. I've had reached out from some teams on the network, hosts, that have said, What do you think that market looks like? And I've conservatively said 22, 23, 24, maybe up to 25 million. Like, that's probably the range. No one's been shocked by that. Like, no one's gotten sticker shock there. But I'll go first on this one. I think the number is going to be higher than Nets fans want it to be. And I think there is almost no chance that Cameron Johnson signs somewhere else unless the number gets really astronomical. I'm not trying to hedge here, but unless it's a really blown out of the water where it would be malpractice to bring him back, Cameron Johnson's coming back. He's a part of the core.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree here. This market's already developing in actually more a robust way than I thought it was going to. So that's the only thing that's throwing me off a little bit with Cameron Johnson here, is that there are already more teams rumored to be in possibly the hunt. We already talked sort of at length about him possibly with the Houston being in the mix. Detroit has entered that. There's been a bunch of different reports where Detroit might kind of see themselves as wanting to skip to the head of the line here. They hire Monty Williams. They want to get better quick, right? Like, it's just, there's a couple of these teams. I mean, Houston's like this too with Ime. So there's these teams with cap space that were bad that maybe envision themselves as something more than lottery teams next year. That I think does throw his market off a little bit because this free agent class is kind of weak. And I do wonder if guys like, Fred VanVleet, who just opted out of his player option, is going to become a free agent. I don't think those places appeal to him, right? Like, is that like where he is? But to Cameron Johnson, who could be looking for just a big payday, because the thing about the NBA, remember, you don't get many chances at this. Like, you have a few opportunities to really hit huge paydays. Yeah. And it's like, you're just obligated to do it. And so I never begrudge guys. Any one of us would do it. If there's more money on the table, you should just go get it. Like, you don't get chances like this every once in a while. If the free agent class is weak and you are a guy that other teams can see themselves, you can kind of fit into a lot of different schemes, right? Like, you're long, you can shoot threes, you can play defense. That kind of guy is needed on every NBA team. I wouldn't begrudge him. I do. So long story short, the market is already kind of more than I thought it was going to be, if these rumors can be believed. And I do think the Nets are in a situation where they see him as probably more than just Cameron Johnson, the basketball player, right? Like, he's Cameron Johnson, friend of Mikal Bridges, who came over for Kevin Durant. Like, there's another, there's an epilogue to his story here that involves the Nets that other teams just aren't going to have it. So I do think they probably go all the way on him. Whether that's correct or not, I don't know, but I'm with you on him coming back.
Yeah, what'll be interesting too for me is, new CBA, new TV money. So this always happens right around these timelines when you go, that contract, 2 years from now, even a year from now, will be looked at differently. And you mentioned a name like Fred VanVleet or any other high profile potential free agent. You can look at those guys. And again, it will become relative. Now, I'm taking a number completely out of thin air. If Cameron Johnson signs for $23 million and Fred VanVleet signs for 30, well, yeah, like, you can start to categorize how the money is being spent, right? So there is a world where when we throw out a number, it's hard to qualify if that was an overpay or not based on what happens around the rest of the league, sign-in trades and otherwise. So that'll be something that we'll definitely keep an eye on. You mentioned the part about, is it a mistake or not? It's hard. Cameron Johnson falls into such a weird category. It's hard to say it. Is he the missing piece for a championship team? He could be in a role, but can most championship teams afford to spend upwards of $25 million to get him? Probably not. If you have a connection on a young roster that thinks your veteran experience is worth something, that's good. And the Nets are just this muddling middle of the road team where you go, we just don't want to be bad. And we know that re-signing Cameron Johnson doesn't throw us into this Eastern Conference final conversation, but we also do know that not re-signing him, and this is probably the biggest reason why the Nets won't be outbid, does not open up $25 million for us to go spend. That's not the way it works, right? So the Nets are in a difficult spot of not necessarily being able to make marginal moves to improve the roster if they didn't retain him. And they know that retaining him doesn't mean that it changes the outlook in the short term for this franchise.
Yeah, like, you'll never get killed for making the signing, I don't think, right? This isn't a move that gets you fired. It doesn't maybe it doesn't get you. I mean, not like Sean Marks is at risk of this, right? But like, it's not
like employee of the month plaque, but
it's just kind of like one of those things that teams sometimes just do, right? Like, there's plenty of transactions like this. It's like, the potential player pool is sometimes smaller than you think around real functional NBA players. you have, to some degree, you have to spend the money. I mean, you don't have to, but like we all understand that there's the salary cap, and then there's the cap and all and the apron and all this other stuff. And a lot of teams are going to go above it. The Nets have had no problem sort of going above it for years. And so I think that sometimes there are just these moves that feel just kind of like the conveyor belt moving down the track at the factory, right? And it's like, hey, this is just what you kind of do. And especially when you're in the Nets position, like you said, which is, they have no championship aspirations, like plus 12,000 to win the championship. They're not going to win the championship next year.
It's your best now,
They have no reason. They have no reason to be bad. So because they just don't have the draft pick. So then you add that into the equation. And so when you add these sort of, externalities to some degree to the situation, you do end up. And then all this other the stuff that I said about Cameron Johnson, that's sort of non-basketball related or right. Or non-on-court related, the friendship, the trade package, wanting to put faces on, moving on from the Kyrie and KD situation. These were the guy that came over as part of those deals to move away from that last era. I think it all just does add up that it makes it a pretty easy decision. And by the way, great news for his agent and him, because it puts him in a situation where he can sort of maybe dictate a slight bidding war based on stuff that he doesn't actually have to prove on the court either. Does that make sense? He's in a great situation right now.
Yeah, it's intangible. I mean, we say this about Mikal Bridges coming over in the Kevin Durant deal, and he's the crown jewel. Cameron Johnson came over in the Kevin Durant deal too, right? Like, he's a part of that package. So we understand there's a hierarchy between these two players, but it's not that far off. And by the way, all of the things about Mikal Bridges, high character guy, just wants to work, wants to be a leader. Like, Cameron Johnson checks all of those boxes as well. Yeah. It's just that he does it at 80% of Mikal Bridges. So there's really no negative there from a Brooklyn Nets standpoint in making this type of deal with a player that will be a restricted free agent. Now, the last note, I think we can just close out this portion of the conversation before we turn to the draft and overall free agency, is the exceptions that the Brooklyn Nets have. Do you think, let's just say Cameron Johnson gets $27 million on the open market, right? Houston goes absolutely ballistic. And I'm putting a number big enough that you would say, okay, the Nets could not sign him and it's all right. I think in that world, then having $18 million and having $7 million in an MLE and a TPE, then I think the Nets actually would try to utilize that to keep themselves at the competitive level that they want to be going into next season. In the scenario where they do bring back Cameron Johnson, we've always talked about those exceptions are very fluid and they don't always get used. You think, and you did a great job weeks ago talking about, here's guys in the $7 million range. You tell me if that excites you when you want to go use the MLE. It doesn't for the most part. So it will be fascinating if that kind of scenario played out. Then I think the Nets would try to maximize the dollar values that they have at their disposal without hurting themselves financially underneath the cap.
I totally agree with that. I think your analysis of the Cameron Johnson situation, if they were to get blown out of the water, is correct, because I still think that actually might be a real danger zone for the Nets, actually, because that might push them into this a scary situation of doing something foolhardy in order to maintain this level of competitiveness that would never really move the needle. So in that way, if you want to talk yourself into that situation where it's just safe to bring them back at a not too exorbitant number, then I think that's maybe the best case to do it.
And oh, by the way, one of those scenarios that can also play out if the number gets that high, sign and trade gets brought onto the table too, where the Brooklyn Nets can stand to benefit from Cameron Johnson signing elsewhere, maybe being able to shed a contract they want to get rid of or get some type of capital back. All right, coming up here in a second, we dive in on the NBA draft coming up next week, as well as free agency overall. Is there a move that the Brooklyn Nets could make that won't necessarily blow the Nets fan base out of the water, but certainly make them feel like they are improving? All right, we are wrapping up our prediction episode as the offseason has officially begun. Breaking news, guys. The Nets didn't win the championship. It was the Nuggets. Son of a gun. They came close. There was some real optimism. Go back and check the odds. Beginning of the season, Nets had a chance, but the roster looked a little bit different. NBA draft night first here, Doug. Picks 21 and 22. A couple days ago, go check this episode out. Doug broke down across, 15 total mock drafts where the numbers suggest the Brooklyn Nets are going to go. What do you think is the most likely scenario on draft night? 2 picks available. How do the Nets approach it? Do they go straight forward and just best player available twice?
Yeah, well, before I say that, I will say just as we get closer to the end of the week and early next week, we're going to do another one of these mock roundups. In addition to whatever like the specific news we're hearing, I mean, we are starting to get some more dialed in for information now, so we are going to do another sort of a bunch of more draft analysis as we go here. Just from specific guys, and then also with us, just sort of some industry consensus. I do think after doing that episode and just thinking about it in this way, which was, I thought it was a really good exercise, like for me personally, to go through about the Nets draft, which is sometimes a very difficult process to get a hold on, especially when they have 2 picks, right? Because you're in some ways it's kind of awesome because it's like, hey, it's like, anytime you've done a fantasy draft, it's like I have 2 picks here back to back. This is amazing. The world's my oyster. But I did kind of end up talking myself into the idea of one safe, one upside kind of guy. I don't know who those guys are right now. And I'm going to feel more confident as we get closer to the draft around that. What I don't think is going to happen is I don't think they're going to trade them. I think they're going to stick. I think they're going to stick it. They kind of have to just draft these guys. They need to get younger and they need to get cheaper. So like at that point, you have to just use your draft picks. But if I had to pick right now, I'm going to double down what I said on that previous episode, which is I think they go, one for me, one for later. Right. And I think, because I just think that makes too much sense. I just think they have a unique opportunity in this range. And this draft, as we're seeing, is just not bad here down in this range. Like in this 20s range, there are guys who definitely fit the bill along both of those things that you would feel pretty good about it, I think.
Yeah, talk to me 3 weeks ago, and I like the idea of Sean Marks kicking this 22nd pick into 2024 and making sure they have another, draft asset that they can utilize. But to your point, the board and the prospects just seem to be looking better. They seem to be looking like more viable options. And I agree with you. It's funny, if I want to go even a layer deeper, one for now, one for later makes a lot of sense. You have needs on this roster. And if we throw in the extra layer that Dorian Finney-Smith or Royce O'Neal, maybe one of the two potentially could be moved here, then you certainly open up significant minutes that you need to fill. If, excuse me, if you don't get choked up about the idea of drafting young players, you would say at 21 and 22, I think the more likely scenario is that the Nets get a wing for now and a guard backcourt player for later, because most of the guards, pure point guard talent, is a lot closer to the lottery, a lot closer to top 10 than it is towards this back end. Now, there's some guys that you could maybe reach back for, and I hate to use familiar names, but like a Ryan Rupert maybe makes sense to put in there. Now, guard, wing, how's he going to develop? And then you can just get into some of the usual names that we talked about and other ones we'll discuss. But a Leonard Miller being there, we talked about Chris Murray. I wouldn't necessarily be excited about that, but even Whitehead, right? In the guard position, one of these two ways, there's a risk in getting up talent that can contribute right now, and there's a safety in looking down the road a little bit. And I think the Nets satisfy both needs by just saying, hey, we believe in this guy, we believe in developing someone, and we know that we have minutes to fill.
And I think there's a world too. So, and there's a third scenario that, and by the way, there's some of these guys like Bryce Sensabaugh, you mentioned Leonard Miller. Yeah. I mean, these were guys that you could really get pretty excited about if they were to quote unquote drop right into the Nets range as, semi-productive now / maybe significant upside later. And I do think with this draft, there's a very real chance there's this kind of third scenario, which fits into the other two pieces to some degree. And that's like the Cam Thomas scenario, which is guy who was projected to go much higher continues to drop for reasons that we're unsure of, right? And remember, if you remember the time, that was the thing with Cam. It was like he was projected to go much higher, and then it finally got to the Nets at 26 or whatever. It was like, hey, he's just still there. We're going to take him. Like this is, we just have to do it. I think
a little buyer beware there, but yeah.
Okay, fine. Has it worked out perfectly? Yeah, there's been times where it worked out like gangbusters, and there's times where it's been hugely head scratching. So I don't really know sort of even where to land with that. But this draft, I do think, because the field is so wide open right now, basically from like 11 on, there's really no consensus around from 11 or 12 on. It feels a little dartboardish here with people. If you just go around and look at where people are landing with different guys, and I think that almost for sure. I mean, one, it's going to definitely benefit the Nets, but two, it's going to open this draft night possibility, I think, for them, which and we're going to be live podcasting all night with the draft. So like no worries there. We'll be on YouTube and everything, and we're going to be following along. So we'll be right in the mix with this, but here's my last prediction. My last prediction is something's going to happen on draft night where we're going to be sitting there at 21 and 22, be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this guy's still there. I do think we're going to get, I have a feeling we're going to get a scenario like that. Now, whether it's correct or not, I'm not sure in terms of like whether the guy should have fallen, but I'm just feeling like that's going to happen because the industry consensus seems to be all over the place.
And you can't have, as we've seen in the last couple of weeks, so many prospects all being talked about improving their stock and rising up draft boards, right? Coulibaly was the guy that we talked about the other day, right? All these guys are surging. Well, there's only 20 spots before the Brooklyn Nets pick, right? So you can't add to the assumed top 10 guys and say, and then we jam 15 more in before the top 20. So I think you're right. And that makes it very exciting for the Brooklyn Nets. And as you mentioned, we'll continue to dive into this deeper as the draft approaches on the 22nd. Last thing then for me here, just to round out our predictions, is free agency outside of the building. We talk about high-level trades with superstars. We talk about the in-house player like Cameron Johnson. I think that it's pretty likely that the Brooklyn Nets make a surprising signing in free agency for a guy that fits the timeline for this roster, a 25 to 27-year-old sets right in there with Mikal Bridges, with Cameron Johnson, Nicholas Claxton, and maybe just changes the dynamic. I'm not talking about starter, but I'm talking about a 15, 20-minute-a-night player that just helps fill a very specific need, especially if you go with a guy that is, see me 2 seasons from now, and it's an area of need, right? Then you go out and you steal someone on the market. I do have someone specific in mind that I'm starting to noodle around on, and maybe I'm going to do a write-up on as well. Does that make sense to you, yo? Do you think the Nets, like, make one marginal steal in free agency that we don't necessarily we're not even thinking about right now because the draft seems like the sole focus at this moment?
I think it'd be tough because of what the money, the limited assets they have to work with here. So I think you really have to be getting someone pretty cheap, but I do think there probably are guys whose stock's fallen. I mean, we talked about Dylan Brooks a while ago. I know no one really wanted. That wasn't your guy, was it? Was it? I don't know.
No. That's not.
Are you gonna say your guy, or are you teasing this for ananother episode? I just wasn't sure.
No, I'll throw it out there, and I'm gonna try to pick the brain of a pretty high profile gentleman that's been on our show recently. So stay tuned for that this week. Mo Wagner, I think is a guy that is in the right position, man. I went and crunched and compared him to some high profile players. And the true shooting percentage, the impact, and the value of his skill set. And again, let me define it. 15 to 20 minutes. Not talking about a 35-minute-a-night starter. But he has all of the offensive skill sets that you'd like to maybe complement what Nicholas Claxton does for you defensively. He's not the perfect player. Again, he's not going to take you from being a first-round team to a Eastern Conference, finals appearance team. But I don't think the cost is going to be too much. I think that that's a guy that could be in the $8 million a year range, and you shed a little bit of money here around the draft, all of a sudden $6 to $8 million a year on a guy that's 25 and maybe is ready to take a little step forward in where his game is. I think something like that won't be overly exciting in the moment. And then we'll talk around like the All-Star break and say, oh, whether it's Mo or someone else, oh, okay, this guy actually ended up being a contributor rather than seeing the DeAndre Jordans of the world languish around this roster and having the Blake Griffins, right? Like there's been so much weak supporting role performances from the Brooklyn Nets over the last handful of seasons. I'd really love it if you looked at the bench and said, all right, this guy is going to come in and give you a consistent role night in, night out.
Buddy coming in with a reasonable take here. I like it. I had no idea where I literally had no idea where you're going.
I usually don't go reasonable. I usually don't go reasonable with my takes. I go a little bit.
I thought it was good when you said Mo. Obviously, everyone in Nets world thought Bamba was going to be coming as the next 2 syllables. But no, he breaks up the Wagner brothers over there in Orlando. I like it. I have to think about that one a little bit more. I was going down. I was using that time to go down. Put a summary in your thing here, but it was going on the list of just the free agents. I thought you were going to say like Boban or something like that. 35-year-old Boban coming into the building. No, I think Mo Wagner. That's a good one, man. I actually no comeback because it's so reasonable. We live in a world that usually is devoid of reasonability around this stuff because it's like, hey, we'll bring in Dame, then it's Cat. And then and then we'll round it out with maybe, it's Dame, it's Cat, it's Mikal Bridges. We don't have to send it. We'll
grab Murray from Atlanta. We'll just bring him in the mix.
That's right. DeJounte Murray gets thrown in the mix. Nets aren't sending anything out, by the way. I mean, they're just these guys. So
Joe Harris, obviously.
So when Mo Wagner enters the room, it's kind of like, Okay, that sounds pretty good.
and that right, yeah. It's all reasonable based on where everyone else talks about. But that's what I think the Nets should be doing, and that's what I think the Nets fan base should want and anticipate is reasonable, smart purchases on free agency, and just add to what you already have here. Be patient. I think that's the name of the game when we talk about my predictions for this offseason.
All right, we're gonna get out of here. Good stuff. Officially the offseason. Officially the beginning of what could be a pretty chaotic couple weeks and maybe month leading into free agency. We're going to have you covered for all of it. Draft, free agency, moves. It's all going to be here at Locked On Nets. Make sure you're subscribed over on YouTube. We're coming at you every day for free. And I got to tell you, in this day and age of this industry, there are just not many people doing that right now. Like when it's only talking about the Brooklyn Nets and talking about it every single day and talking about it with passion, not even tooting our horn about it. How many other people are out there? This is where it's at for if you're a Brooklyn Nets fan. This is where you got to be. Just go subscribe over on Locked On Nets over on YouTube.
You're never too old, too wacky, or wild to pick up a book and read to a child. Dr. Seuss.
Oh, one of the all-time overrated poets. We will be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.